This is Human Essence, and on today's video, I'm going to be doing a book review on Desperate Remedies by Andrew Scull, Psychiatry's Turbulent Quest to Cure Mental Illness. Now, I read this book some time ago, but I'm just going to go over some details about it. So the author is a journalist and has written many books on this topic. And you'll see in the beginning of the book that it's in memory of somebody who seems to have been in his family who died very young. So I'm not sure if he's had some contact with this world or a tragic event, but I'm wondering if that has something to do with him writing this book. So it's a very detailed book, really a lot of history in it, a lot of the differences of opinions of people going back and forth, but it really makes you think about the history of treating people with mental illness in this country. So he begins by discussing the asylum era, which is from the 1820s onward, where there's the idea of the curability of mental illness, which justifies building all these large asylums. So they come to see that the contrast of this optimistic idea of the curability of mental illness when it's taken with regard to the dismal reality of these huge asylums full of people who are really not doing very well at all. They're just being housed there sometimes in terrible conditions. So the people who were running the asylums, those doctors were considered the alienists, and they were marginalized by most of the medical profession. So there was a little bit of a rift between them, the asylum doctors, and their neurologists. So we see the huge state asylums being built. So there was, prior to this idea of the curability of mental illness, there was an idea of mental illness being a catastrophe that could happen to anyone. But by the time we reach the 1850s, there's new accounts of the roots of insanity are being developed, and some of these ideas are very dark indeed about degeneration and defects. And we see at that time that there's the beginning of electricity being considered something that's important by neurologists, whereas people with money are sending people to have a rest cure, where the idea is to build up the fat and blood. And soon there were like private establishments for the wealthy who were going there for these rest cures. And if you've read any of the history of, say, Virginia Woolf, who seems to have suffered from bipolar disorder, she was like just put to bed and fed a lot whenever she was having one of her episodes there. That's what they did during that period of time in her cultural background in England. So anyway, later on, we start to have new theories about what to do about this degeneration, and or as they called it. And we have Kellogg, the person who the cereal is named for, and he had ideas of clean bowels and vegetarianism and also purity of the races. That's something that was important to him. So he thought a lot of mental illness was caused by the bowels. And then he also thought some of the best things to do were for people just to kindly be killed, especially the feeble-minded. And there was terrible treatment and very different ways of treating people in southern hospitals where there was a lot of racism. So that's a part of our history in this country with mental illness as well. So we go on, and there are ideas about psychobiology coming about later on, with the Christian Science movement happening, and Meyer's ideas of habit training. And habit training will fight this degeneration and will help. At about soon after that, Freud makes his visit to America, but his ideas don't catch on right away, and he's very skeptical of his ideas actually being useful for serious mental illness, such as what we would now recognize as schizophrenia. But that didn't stop people from trying that later on. Then there were ideas apparently of germ madness. So bacteriological revolution, germs and pus had to be eliminated from the body, and there needed to be thorough cleansing of the organs, very often by removing them surgically, such as by removing the stomach or the tonsils or other organs, or the bowels, other organs that might be holding these germs, which would be causing this mental illness, or they needed to be thoroughly cleansed. And again, Kellogg thought thorough cleansing of the bowels, vegetarianism, and eating a lot of cereal would cure this mental illness, because of those germs and bacteria that were there that would be gotten rid of by eating that cereal. So we come on to like the 1920s and 30s, and at that point they said the best way to get rid of these germs was to induce fevers in people. So they would induce things like what it would be like to have a rat bite, or inject people with malaria, and in inducing fevers would cure that mental illnesses. And then we go on to the 1930s, where they thought shock therapy. And the more the better, just electrical shock therapy would snap people right out of these mental illnesses. And then we move on to the age of the surgery of the brain. So those were lobotomies that were held, and there were a lot of wealthy people sending, family members. We hear the story of the Kennedy sister who actually had the lobotomy. So moving on in time, we have the new psychiatry, and even though Freud said this wouldn't work for serious mental illness, there's talk therapy and the New York Psychoanalysis Society, and that became the most prevalent kind of treatment for mental illness. But post-war, in 1945, there were so many soldiers coming back from the war with what we would recognize now as trauma. And so that enabled some of the clinical psychologists to split apart from the medical hierarchy that had been in the hospitals. So there was a lot more of the psychoanalysis. And that went on for a while until we got to the 1960s, where they started to blame parents and families. And so they, especially if there was asthma as well as a mental illness, they would assume naturally that hay fever, anything like that. What they would do was completely sever the relationship between the person who had the mental disorder or hay fever or whatever from their families, and also make sure that those family members, usually females, usually the mother, would be, blamed and not trusted to do anything for their family member. And then the there was that split between the psychoanalysis and the medical doctors, and there's always this split between the neurologist and the psychiatrist. But then we get the cognitive revolution. So that is, Ellis, Bandura, Beck, those ideas of, the beginnings of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And then that was what came next was the birth of pharmacological things, where we have the thorazines, and then later on the newer medications, and then we have the Prozac eventually comes about in the 1990s, where just about they thought everybody had depression and everybody should take Prozac, even though there were some tests where it was not working, but it was the advertising started to come about, as well as the new medications for a number of other disorders that we still see today. Community care replaced some of the larger hospitals, which left less expenses to the state hospitals, and so more fell to the community care, which increased homelessness, and also some of the jails. People were incarcerated who had mental illnesses who were left out of the hospitals. So it goes on like this. So it's the book is very, very complex, and it has a great amount of detail about all the people so involved in all the differences and how they, first it was just people, experimenting and coming up and not having too much of experience and coming up with some idea and kind of, taking the people and trying it until it didn't work, and somebody else said, oh, that's ridiculous, and we're doing something completely different, so we're not going to do surgery, we're going to shock them. So it's a little bit disturbing, and as a whole, I think the book doesn't cover the modern things there are in much detail, because he's not feeling, it's not too hopeful of a book. But I recommend this if you are interested in this topic and you want to read a lot of details about it. Anyway, thanks for listening. Then again, maybe not. Celebrate uncertainty.